Hey, I'm Caleb, part of the Narrate team. Thanks for listening to the Narrate podcast. This week is part 2 of a 4-part series called Toxic Views. This week we explore questions like, what if God defines safety differently than we do? And then also, what if God wants you to know that He's with you and not that you're safe?
Hi, how you doing? Did it bother anybody else that the lines on the circus tent don't match? Did anybody else notice that? Bob, did you notice that? All you builders out there? Yeah, it's OCD, it's a disease. Sometimes there's things that happen behind the scenes that are best left behind the scenes, and sometimes I think it's worth acknowledging them. And this morning, to the band's credit, they had a drummer call in nauseous this morning at about 6 a.m., and so Jesse went from vocals to drums and lots of mixing and matching, and just really, really grateful for those guys. It's neat. For us as a staff, we work really, really hard to create excellence here on Sundays, and sometimes everything we try doesn't work, and there's sometimes something that's very, very refreshing about that. All kinds of little things that happened this morning, not the least of which is I woke up in the profound need for Pepto-Bismol, if you know what I mean. So there's some profound advantages to that particular medicine and some profound disadvantages, but we're all about what the advantages are now, right? So I try not to take full responsibility for everything I say, but that's especially true this morning because it's a little dicey in my brain. So we started the series last week called Toxic Views, and maybe the best way to start this morning is the way we ended last week, because we could have started last week the way we ended last week. With me? We ended last week by just simply talking about that it's gross. When there's perhaps nothing more gross than someone telling you that your view of God is all wrong and theirs is all right. I think probably as much as we all don't have in common, we probably all have that in common, that there's maybe nothing that's just more repulsive and just feels more just nasty than to have someone say, your view's all wrong, but mine is perfectly well intact. In fact, we're going to do a series in February, and I'm going to talk about what's your name and what breaks your heart. And to be perfectly honest with you, for me, what breaks my heart is a understanding of God and Jesus that claims to be 100% point on and that believes that there's nothing new to be learned. That kind of telling culture of God and church and the Bible and Jesus, it's just gross to me. But what we said last week is if we can allow that that's gross, that it's just gross to be told you're all wrong, I'm all right, could we then also allow that it's quite possible to develop what are very toxic views of God? Like, it's tricky in our culture, right? To tell anybody that their view of God is less than perfect is a tricky thing to do. So if we can just acknowledge that none of us likes a know-it-all when it comes to God, no one likes someone who claims to have it figured out, could we also agree that you actually can develop deep convictions about God and His character, the result of which isn't trivial, and it's not confined to places like this and conversations like this one, but that it can actually make you a worse kind of boss, a worse kind of parent, a worse kind of person, a different type of money manager? Like, do you know what I mean? And so really what we're doing in this series is just saying, what if you've developed, what if you've adopted, maybe even what if you've been past some views of God and His character that are wrong? And the result of that is sabotaging the life you could otherwise live. Really, last week we asked this question, in what ways are your views of God toxic? Now the elephant, because that bears explanation and probably will every time in this series. Some of you may remember that when a long time ago, when baby elephants were captured from the wild and trained for the circus, there was a specific method employed there, and that method involved capturing said baby elephant and tying it to a very strong steel spike. They would drive this big spike in the ground. They would attach a very heavy, strong chain, one end to the spike, the other end to the baby elephant's ankle, and then that baby elephant would do what? He would throw a baby elephant hissy fit. Kick and scream and pull and push and do everything in his power, sometimes for days, to get free, and it couldn't. That's the way the situation was designed. But the situation was also designed because they knew that in 10 years, there's nothing they would be able to do on the circus circuit traveling across the country to keep that elephant secure, so they had to trick it. So fast forward 10 years, and that same elephant, it's not a baby elephant anymore. It's a massive, unbelievably powerful, strong adult elephant. And 10 years later, what they would do is they would just take a little stick, mostly superficial. They'd take a rope, also superficial, tie one end to the stick, the other end to the baby elephant's ankle, tight enough that he knew it was there. And then you know what that adult elephant would do? Nothing. because in his head, he was a baby elephant. In his head, there was still a big spike and a strong chain, and he was stuck, which means the only thing keeping that elephant there 10 years later was a myth, a lie. It was mythology. It was a toxic view. And so what we're doing in this series, and listen, it's not lost on me that it takes a profound level of humility. I've experienced the emotional exhaustion of it myself. Many of you that I've heard from are already kind of experiencing the difficulty of this. But to take it up and go, wait, what if there's a benefit to being reminded of how baby circus elephants were trained? Because what if that same thing happens to us? I have a friend who's a fish biologist or works in that field, and he shared a study, actually emailed me a study this week that was conducted by a German researcher. And this German researcher took a pike, and he put it in a large aquarium of several pike fish, and then inside this aquarium, and then they put a bunch of the fish that this pike would normally feed on. But the trick was they put a partition in the aquarium. So you had these pike and you had these fish that these fish would normally feed on, and then they created a partition so the pike couldn't get to the fish, but they didn't know it. And so, of course, the pike would ram into that glass partition over and over and over and over again. Eventually, they're like us. It takes them a while, but they learned their lesson, and they stopped ramming their head into the glass. And then that researcher, and they did it in two different ways. One time they supplemented the pike's need for food. The other time they didn't. But then what the researcher did was they removed the partition. And what do you suppose happened? The same thing. See, the pike, the partition was moved, the obstacle was taken care of, and yet the pike still didn't go get these fish that it could feed on. In one case, in one of the studies, the pike almost starved to death. The food was there, it was available, but they were convinced they couldn't get it. And so that's what we're exploring, and that's the picture of what we're talking about. It's been fun to hear from some of you. I heard from one person who said that their view of God is that he's pretty chill and laid back, and they're beginning to realize, wait a minute, maybe that's not accurate. Maybe I'm chill and laid back, and maybe God cares more about the details of my life than I think. Heard of another person who said that they're realizing that they view the cross as a get-out-of-jail-free card, that they've understood that they can do anything they want because they can always just return to the cross and ask for forgiveness, which in some sense is true, but in another sense is, of course, toxic. Heard from a student who said that they just think God is just harsh. That was their statement. I just think God is harsh. From another person, they said that they realize in this process that they live as though God is perpetually disappointed in them, that they are a disappointment to God, that he's embarrassed by them repetitively. So this is work, and part of what's tricky about this series, like I don't pay the staff to give me compliments. But this Tuesday, when we got back to review this weekend, they were all incredibly complimentary about last weekend, to which I had to say, well, and they were all like, can't wait for next week. And I was like, there is no next week. I don't have anything else to talk about, because in this series, I feel like all I can do is ask the question. Like, in what ways are your views of God toxic? All I can really do is ask that and beg you to open up the Gospels and read about Jesus for yourself, and go and make the conversations with your therapists and your friends and your parents and those that you're doing life with along this line, because you kind of have to do this work yourself. And so this morning, the only way I do know to continue, I heard Andy Stanley say something a few years ago that impacted me. Because when you're in my role, I think every occupation has its hazards and fears, like selling people a piece of junk house, or building a house that falls down and kills them, or wiring a house and then it burns to the ground, or every occupation has its hazards, right? Bad diagnoses, all the malpractice, all kinds of things. Mine, here's the things that terrify me: passing out on stage, barfing on stage, wishing I had a Depends on stage. All of which are viable options this morning, by the way, and not having anything to say. And I heard Andy Stanley say years ago, he said, as long as I would continue to talk about my own brokenness, I would never run out of things to say. And so this morning what I want to do, I think as much out of modeling and reinforcing the value of this process, is to talk about this, the toxic view that I'm a couple months ahead of you in this conversation, and the toxic view that for me is most strongly rooted in my view of God, and yet I think most detrimental. And let me say this before we jump in. I wish I had a couple more weeks to study this through. I wish I could fly back to George Fox and spend some more time with my professors on this issue. I wish there was many of you. I wish I could have coffee and talk this through all the more. I don't think that my thinking and doctrine and theology on this one is sound and perfect, but it sounds something like this. What if God isn't particularly interested in your safety? Like, what if your safety isn't as big a priority to God as it is to you? What if when what you want to hear from God is you're safe, he says instead, I'm with you. And what if I'm with you and you're safe are two completely different things? Maybe we could think of it this way. Have you ever thought about what feelings you're addicted to? Like what your desired feelings? Have you ever considered that you are a feeling junkie? That there are a few select feelings and you live your life in pursuit of them? Like an alcoholic, there's a certain feeling. A workaholic, there's a certain feeling. Those of you who work out, you know that there's a feeling, and you also know that can go too far. Those of you that love business, you love to make money, so many of the things we love them because there's a feeling associated with them. Let me ask you this, what's the feeling that you live your life for? What are the few feelings that if you could just have them, you wouldn't need God or your wife or anybody else, because you'd have everything you wanted because you had those few feelings perpetually. Ever thought of that? I've realized in my journey over the years, and especially in this series as I was kind of praying through and processing, because this work is work I did a couple months ago and I'm still trying to do, I've realized that for me the one feeling is the feeling of safety. Like if I could just feel safe, like everything's going to be okay, everything's going to turn out good in the end everybody will be comfortable and happy again. If I could just have that, I'd be content. Now I know that's a little emasculating, and I guess I have to be okay with that. And I'm not saying that I haven't experienced the pleasure of accomplishment, of significance, of progress, of winning, if you will. I think what I'm asking is, what are your shadow feelings? We talked a couple months ago about shadow goals, that we can set goals, but we don't declare them, and they're dark, and they're really selfish, and because we don't declare them, we pursue them, but nobody knows, sometimes even us. What are your shadow feelings? What are the things that maybe you'd be ashamed to admit it? Maybe you don't even know it. Maybe it would take some work to figure out what they are. For me, it's safety. In fact, we asked this question last week, who do you think of when you think of God? And when I asked that question, I realized a couple things. First of all, I think I started following Jesus at 19 largely because I believed he could give me that feeling in a way nothing else I had tried up until that point could. I don't think that's a slight on God. I think it's one on me. But when I ask the question, who do you think of when you think of God? Listen, I'm guessing you're like me in that when I think of my parents and my family of origin, I am incredibly grateful for them. They taught me some really good stuff, and they taught me some garbage. And I'm teaching my kids some really good stuff, and I'm teaching them some garbage. I just think that's unavoidable. When I look at my family of origin, both sides, I see a mantra that is so thick in us. And it's this idea of better safe than sorry. Like the highest win is be safe, be safe, be safe. This last Thursday, I dropped my wife off at the airport. She was on her way to Ecuador. She was going to work with an organization that was born out of this community from a woman who was from that area of the world, who saw a need in that area. They're now a part of this church, this community, and the need that they saw was that there are these kids in Ecuador, in this third world country, who were born with things like CP, and they don't have the money for therapy, and so they don't get care. And this woman, nothing like kind of we're going to change the world. She just went, I know this region of the world. I know that there's this disproportionate amount of handicapped people because the government also doesn't protect them from sexual abuse. And so you've got this perpetual thing that's happening in their culture. And I know that there's this 16-year-old kid who has CP who could walk, but because he doesn't get physical therapy, he can't walk. And so what she started was an organization called Families with Heart, and many of you are a part of it, but it just involves monthly sponsorships of these kids and these people's therapy. I could tell you the story of one kid who they were going to see, because what they do is they go every 6 months and they hand deliver the cash to the therapists and the families to make sure the therapies are happening. There was one kid, he was 16, he had CP, he had never walked. First time they met him, the experts with them said, this kid could walk. The reason he's not walking is because he's not had any therapy. And so after a couple of years working with Families with Heart and getting his therapy from local providers, which is awesome in its own right because you're stimulating the economy that way, I could show you a video and it would rip your heart out of this kid at now 18 years old walking down a hallway for the first time. And the only reason he could do that because he couldn't before was because someone provided for his therapy. Now, my point is simply this. I was dropping my wife off at the airport. She loves medical mission type stuff. Like if we all got struck by lightning and died, me and my kids included, there's no doubt in my mind, if at all possible, she's moving to the bush in Africa because God is most apparent and she is most alive when she's serving in these third world countries. She's going because they're going to deliver this cash, and because they deliver this cash, this organization is going to exist for another 6 months in that country. And I drop her off at the curb of the airport, and you know what I want to say to her? You know what every fiber in my being naturally says to her as a goodbye? Be safe. Not, man, I can't wait to hear how you experience God while you're there. Not go serve your brains out. Not like this is so exciting because kids like that one kid I just told you about, he's going to get another 6 months of therapy. Not there's a deaf community down there that's been identified, and my wife's parents are deaf, and so she has a background there. And they're starting there's no deaf education for these deaf people. And now they found a translator a deaf person who signs in Spanish. And now they're starting a deaf school. Not like, man, get that school started. My natural inclination. Be safe. I guess my question is, what if that's an affront on everything God is and everything he invites us into? Well, what if we define safety perhaps differently than God does? And what if we give that emotional sense of safety a priority that, quite frankly, God doesn't give it? Some of you remember we did this series this fall called Necessary Endings. I remember we talked about sometimes you prune stuff out of your life to create room for new growth. Sometimes you prune it out because it's diseased. Well, in that season, one of the observations that I made in terms of proactively pruning was that it's about an 8-minute walk from my house to our offices downtown. And I realized that I walk to the office like this, and I'm sure none of you do this, like to and from the office, and I'm not solving the world's problems. I'm reading about the Broncos and the Cardinals and maybe texting or answering emails, but I was literally that guy who, like step into the street. Oh, wait, that's a street. Did anybody relate to me? Yeah. So I had this moment where I just felt like God was going, hey, Adam, you don't memorize scripture anymore? And I was like, yeah, I don't have time. And then he's like, and the other thing is I'm sure you've noticed this, but my best ideas, they come when I'm not trying to think about ideas, in the spontaneity of walking or running or something like that. And so I just felt this challenge of using my walk to and from my office to either memorize scripture, because so many people talk about it is the number one most fruitful discipline when it comes to reshaping your mind, or thinking, but thinking without the distraction of device. So all that to say, I've been memorizing Psalm 23 for about 14 years. I'm a slow memorizer. I've been memorizing it since then. And I don't know about you, but my guess is that most of us think of Psalm 23 as the consummate, like, coffee mug verse. It's this warm and fuzzy verse that's all about how safe and secure we are because God loves us. And I guess this morning I'd like to turn the lens on that just a little bit and see if we could maybe rethink some of that. David starts this way: "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing." And let me ask you this. When do you find yourself needing a shepherd? See, we think of this warm, fuzzy thing, but when do you find yourself needing to remind yourself that you lack nothing? When everything's going smooth and great and you just feel on top of the world? Or is it different than that? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. Let me ask you this. When you feel the need for a refreshed soul, what prompts that? This overwhelming sense that everything's beautiful and perfect, and that horrible Lego movie song, everything is awesome. Is that? Well, you kind of need refreshed after you listen to that song, but that's, again, for the wrong reasons. I think at first glance we see David describing this life of ease where everything is perfect and everything's in control. And I wonder if what we see him confessing to God is, God, this life that you've called me to live, it's causing me to remind myself that you're leading me. It's causing me to remind myself that sometimes I need a break because life's about to break me. He continues, he guides me along the right paths. And we all go, sweet, like that one. But then there's this giant catch-22, for his name's sake. Ever notice that for many of the people in the Bible, like following God didn't turn out good for them? If you followed God for any length of time, you realize that God's not particularly interested in leading you along the path that gives you glory or you fame, but that gives him glory and him fame. That sometimes the right path is profoundly difficult and painful and torturous and undesirable. I was reminded this week of John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin. And one day, his cousin, who spoke out against Herod and therefore was thrown in jail because he spoke out against Herod, he realized he was about to lose his head. And so he sent his friends to Jesus to say, hey, are you the one? Are you the Messiah? And Jesus quoted back to him, he cited back to his disciples some passages from Isaiah, because Isaiah had said when the Messiah shows up, there's these things that will happen because the Messiah has shown up. And in Matthew 11, we have this moment, and listen to what Jesus says. Like, here's the message to go tell John, because John's going, either you rescue me, and if you're God, you will rescue me, because you're a God who doesn't like me to be in discomfort. So if you're God, then please do that. And listen to what Jesus says. Go tell him, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. But an astute student of the text, which isn't me, I'm just a plagiarist, what they would recognize is that Jesus left a part of this quote out. See, there's another thing Isaiah said, and that other thing Isaiah said was, and the captive will be set free. And so Jesus says, hey, yeah, I'm the one, and go tell John, his discomfort is of my design. Go tell John that I'm still God, and he's still stuck in prison, and his head is still in peril. We don't like that, do we? I want a God who says, Adam, you're safe, and I wonder if what God says is, no, you're not, maybe, but I'm with you. And if there's a profound difference between those two things, Psalm 23 continues. He says, he leads me into, even though I walk through the darkest valley. Let me ask you, does this sound like David's experience of God is one in which God says, if you follow me, the only emotion you'll ever experience is safety. If you follow me, there will be no troubles and no employees are going to quit and there's not going to be any difficulty and no sickness and nobody dies and everything's great and there is no divorce and there is no disease, none of that. Follow me and it'll all be great. Does it seem like that's David's experience? You know, one of the most frustrating passages to me in the entirety of Jesus' life is in Mark 6. And listen, I don't mean to trivialize this because I realize some of you're thinking of real death and real dysfunction and real deep-seated problems, and I'm not trying to trivialize that or be cutesy about it. But in Mark 6, Jesus and his guys, they were busy doing what they were doing. The demands upon them were intense. And so they get to this place where they need some green pastures. And Jesus says to his guys, get in the boat and head off to the other side of the lake. And so they do. But there's a catch here. See, because Jewish people, they don't like water. You go to Israel today, and I've done it twice, and you get on the bluffs that overlook the Sea of Galilee. It's the most astounding thing. It is the most beautiful lake. It's got the same kind of proportions as Hauser Lake, and you look down on the lake, and it's glass. No water skis, no boats, no water skiers. If you see a boat, there's this one token boat, and it's this giant, tacky, blue and white boat with a giant cross in the front, and it's full of tourists. Because the Jews don't like water. They're desert people. And so when he says to the disciples, go to the other side, he's pushing them way out of their comfort zone. The water is the abyss. Add to that the fact that this lake is like Canyon Ferry. It's famous for its storms out of nowhere. I know I've said this before, but have you ever noticed that one of the things I noticed as a non-Helena native is all you Helena natives, you all have your I almost died on Canyon Ferry story. Like, you all have that story. I almost died on there. And then you're like, but I'm going boating next week. I'm like, there's 2 other Great Lakes. Why does anyone go to Canyon Ferry anymore? Because you all have these stories. Why? Because these storms coming out of nowhere, and I haven't been there. I don't even drive by Canyon Ferry. It's too freaky. But there's these storms that come out of nowhere, and there's these massive swells. That's what happened on the Sea of Galilee. The geography was such that these storms would come in, and you couldn't see them coming, and when they hit, they were ferocious. So there's the context. Jesus says, get in a boat. Besides that, it looks like they probably went straight across to the other side because the other side were Greeks. But these guys, that wouldn't have been the default. They would have liked to follow the coast. Like that's the way Adam would cross the lake. That's the way Jews crossed the lake. Looks like Jesus said, head out across the middle of the lake. And a storm hits. But Jesus isn't with them. See, Jesus said, go to the other side. Meanwhile, he said, I'm going to go pray. That sounds a little trite, doesn't it? He goes up on a bluff. He's on this bluff. He's praying. He's talking to God. And the text says this could mess with you in your understanding of God and safety and all this stuff, because what the text describes is Jesus is up on the bluff and he's watching the disciples freak out during the storm. Which, of course, they're freaking out. Who doesn't freak out when they're on a lake in the middle of a storm? And the text says he was watching them strain at the oars. And then you expect to go fast forward, and then Jesus hurried and ran over to them and saved them. No, it says, no, he prayed through all night. Finally, it says Jesus decided to go out. And you're going, what's about time? And this is the famous Jesus walked on water moment. Jesus, he gets down to the lake, and he just starts walking across the lake. I know that's its own conversation. He starts walking across the lake. And listen to what Mark says. Now, scholars debate what exactly is behind all this. I'm just going to take it at its base observation. Listen to what the text says. He was about to pass by them. Well, that's convenient, right? These guys are struggling in the boat. They're about to drown. I'm God, so I'm just going to walk across. That sucks to be you guys. Sorry for the word, but it seems like that's what's going on here. And then you can go read the story for themselves. They recognize that it's him, and they're like, well, they don't recognize it's him. They think it's a ghost. And they're like, a ghost. And then Jesus is like, you blew my cover. Guess I better get in the boat and rescue you. My point is simply this. Does that sound like a God whose priority in your life is to protect you from storms? Does it sound like a God who says, the more you love me and the more faith you have, then the less disease and the less trial and the less difficulty and the more emotional stability and the better it goes? I think David's view is a little more honest. He even says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, even though, he says, again, what does it sound to you like David's experience of God is something that's perfect? And this is what gets me to this place, because I don't know about you, but when I'm on the chairlift and it stops moving, I'm like, isn't that the worst feeling in the world? And you start figuring out where your legs are going to break if you jump and how much emotional strength you have to stay there until it moves. I was trying to figure out one time what kind of harness thing I could make that I could stick in my pocket to get off the rope, because I know I'm eventually moving on the chair. It's the waiting that drives me crazy. If I could rappel myself off the chairlift instantly, that would be the best. Anyway. Don't you just want to know you're safe? God, I'm having a hard time paying the bills. God, my wife is sick. God, I have this mental thing going on. God, we just lost a child. God, don't you just want to know, don't you just want a God who's like that over-mothering mom who just puts this hand on your shoulder and says, it's always going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Is it? See, part of what messes with me is I want God to tell me it's always going to be okay. I want him to tell me that every situation ends with a happy ending. But then I also think, aren't I setting myself up for an incredible crisis of faith? Because they can't all end good, can they? I'm not talking mathematics. I'm talking life. Like someday she's dying. Right? The great, aggravating, terrorizing thing of marriage. Someone's burying somebody. At some point, the story doesn't have a happy ending. At some point, the disease wins, if only temporarily. What if God's message isn't you're safe? What if it's I'm with you? And the life of faith is learning the power and the significance and the importance of walking with God as though in the garden, finding the comfort of, turns out you're not on the chairlift alone, Adam. I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm reading a book called Unapologetic by a British thinker, and his argument is that Christianity makes surprising emotional sense. It's a really fascinating argument that the text and the life that the Bible describes makes more emotional sense than any alternative. And one of the things he talks about is a particular campaign that was rampant through the city of London a couple of years ago by neo-atheists. And the campaign slogan was this. We have a picture of one of the buses. It was actually called the bus campaign. It simply says, there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Let me ask you this. What's the dangerous word in that statement? See, I think probably is refreshingly honest. I think every relationship has a probably. Now, I don't think this. I'm just a plagiarist. That's what he thinks. So I'm with you. I would have guessed probably too. I think it's the word enjoy. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not a Puritan who's saying joy is a bad thing and we should just make ourselves miserable. I'm a big fan of joy. Joy is a lovely thing. The more joy I can have, the better. Wouldn't you agree? But doesn't that depart from everyone's actual life experience? Isn't that a gigantic departure from the emotional experience we have in life? Is it really reasonable to say that if you could just move the God piece out of the conversation, that if you could just move any one thing, let alone God, out of the conversation, that all you'll experience is perpetual enjoyment? Does that sound remotely honest? Do you fully anticipate that the only emotion you're going to experience today or tomorrow or this week or this year is enjoyment? Doesn't that seem like malpractice at its worst? Like, sure, I'm hoping, because if you're not hoping to experience enjoyment, then we do need to get you to a doctor because there is some sickness there. But I'm hoping you're anticipating experiencing enjoyment. But aren't you also expecting that you're going to experience disappointment, grief, frustration, anger, bitterness? The exhilaration of a victory, the exhilaration of a job well done? Aren't you hoping to experience peace and love? Aren't there lots of things, some of which are incredibly good and some of which are incredibly bad, that you anticipate experiencing in this next season of time, say in the rest of your life? See, here's my question. What if we want a God who says, follow me, and it'll be enjoyment all the time, every day, until it's all over? And yet, what if what God says back to us is that's toxic? What if what God says back to us is you are going to experience lots of things? You're going to experience anger and bitterness, hope and excitement. You're going to experience victories and failures. You're going to experience health. And you're going to experience death. You're going to experience a lot of things that come with a lot of emotions. But I'm with you. And in fact, even death won't separate me from you. What if what Jesus is saying is, I can't promise you that you're always going to be safe? At least not yet. Not this side of the veil. Not in this heaven and this earth. And so David says, even though I walk through the darkest of valleys, I will fear no evil. Why? Because it won't exist. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I don't know about you, but I know I signed up to follow God because I thought it just made life a whole lot easier. And that the emotional exhaustion that comes with being a human in this world, in relationship with hopes and dreams, was too much to bear, and that Jesus would somehow solve all that. What I'm learning when I go to the scriptures is I've not gained a life that's easy. I've gained a God who says, I made you, I love you, I have purposes for you, and there are advantages of walking with me that are greater than circumstantial advantages. Jesus says to his guys at the end of his life, guys, I've got a really tough job for you. I need you to go and I need you to just communicate, narrate the story of me to the world. And they say, yeah, but that sounds scary because you got killed. And he said, yeah, and surely I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Listen, if you're here and you're still trying to reconcile God and what it might mean to follow him, I feel like the most honest thing I could say to you is what it won't mean. What it won't mean is all your troubles go away. What it won't mean is you'll never be scared again. What it won't mean is you'll never be disappointed again. That's the opposite of what it means. What it means is that God wants to walk with you. And that part of you that reaches out and wants to be reaffirmed that you're safe, in fact, God made you. And he knows what you really need is his friendship, his companionship, his leadership. And for those of you that do follow Jesus, I don't know in what ways that you've been asking him to make you safe. My hope is that you be reminded that that's not his goal. That his goal is that you would walk with him. And as Dallas Willard says, that relationship with him would become so intimate that when you died, you wouldn't even know it for a couple days. Because there was such of a lack of interruption to your relationship with God.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.